Hello, dear friend. Thank you for hanging out with a couple multiples today. We are your hosts, Drew
and Garden System. We are a married couple that both have Dissociative Identity Disorder, or DID.
Our lives are both ordinary and uniquely complex. Perhaps you were introduced to DID in a movie or TV show, or maybe you have been diagnosed with the disorder, or you are a therapist that wants to learn more about working with a client that has it.
Whatever the case may be, we are glad you are here to learn all about the differences between support and caretaking, the importance of boundaries within the therapeutic relationship, as well as with friends and family members, thoughts and ideas about choosing your community, and creating your own chosen family for support, and unmasking your authentic selves, including disclosure. You are making a difference by choosing to listen to this podcast today because you can help prevent harm to those living with DID when you are empowered with knowledge to reduce the stigma around being a multiple.
You can help dispel myths about DID and help spread awareness by sharing this podcast with a friend or loved one. Please visit acoupleofmultiples.com. Together, we can make a difference by taking the disorder out of dissociative identities. Hello there, and thank you for tuning into this legendary Season 1 finale with Drew
and Garden System,
a couple of multiples.
As you learned from our previous episodes, we are a married couple that were both diagnosed with Dissociative Identity Disorder, or DID.
We have both learned a lot throughout our healing journey about the importance of boundaries. Survivors have experienced the violation of boundaries and often need to learn how to set appropriate boundaries with others and identify when another person doesn't have solid boundaries, including therapists and people that are trying to help. Having and creating boundaries within relationships with others helps one feel safe and protected, which for me personally is the most important concern of mine. After a childhood and early adulthood where all of me, did not feel safe, creating safety in the present moment is the best gift we have given ourselves.
Creating safety can be extremely difficult to do when you don't know what safety is or what it should feel like. When you grow up with your boundaries being violated over and over again, you never learn where you should draw the line with other people. It becomes ingrained that others will always just walk all over you, or you think that there is something wrong with you by having to set boundaries in the first place. Parents sometimes think and act like their children aren't actual people and don't allow their children to ever assert anything at all. This leaves children to grow up into vulnerable adults who will get hurt over and over again. The first place we really learned to establish healthy boundaries was in therapy. And that's why healthy boundaries in a therapeutic relationship are essential in trauma-informed care.
So, what do healthy therapeutic boundaries look like? I think for me, as a client, it was helpful for my therapist to be upfront about things like how much and what kind of contact was okay between our sessions. Were they okay with hugs? And it was important that each of my parts that interacted with my therapist knew these boundaries too. I feel like communication is key in setting appropriate boundaries. I think this involves therapists asking themselves what are healthy, appropriate, firm boundaries that will help my clients feel safe and reduce the risk of harm. Therapists also need to understand the difference between offering support versus caretaking.
Being clear about what is okay or not okay is super important. Boundaries will not be exactly the same for every single person. You have to have conversations about what makes you comfortable or uncomfortable. As a client that is often dissociated, we weren't always aware of whether or not we felt comfortable. We're not always aware of things that should be considered a red flag or even a green flag. If you throw in some neurodiversity, these social cues of understanding boundaries can feel extremely confusing as well. We would often bring up and discuss what was okay or what was not okay with interactions and communications with our therapist. Attachment can become tricky, and often we feel this desperate need for contact or attention especially when littles start liking someone. Seeing a therapist is often the first time we feel seen, heard, and that we actually matter. So naturally, we gravitate towards that attention. And therapists, with their genuine caring self, will be very giving and attentive to their clients. And this is where healing can occur or harm can occur.
One thing that personally helped us build a positive, secure, healthy attachment to our therapist was her allowing us to email or text her if we were having trouble or were in distress between sessions. The boundary was clear. The communication between sessions was brief and a way to check in when things were rough. We also found it reassuring that we could email specific things that we wanted to talk about the next session. And parts could write things that they felt might have been missed when we were in person. That could also be addressed when we met next. I could see that communicating between sessions could cross into the harmful territory if the therapist says that texting or emailing is okay, but then ignores the texts or emails. And to the other extreme, where the texting or emailing is excessive and the therapist is essentially doing therapy sessions outside of scheduled office time.
Right. Flexibility is important. Boundaries should not be rigid. When you have DID and you attend a session, not every part will get a chance to talk or voice their thoughts and might feel like they missed out. If we dissociate the whole session away, it can feel like we didn't get to attend therapy at all. Sometimes emailing is a way to share what was unable to be shared. Then at our next session, our therapist knows what topics need to be discussed and she isn't going down an unnecessary rabbit trail. There are times when we get more lengthy responses to our emails, and there are times when all that is said is, "Thank you for sharing that. We will discuss it in our next session." It can be a huge relief to get that shameful and or difficult subject off our chest and know that it will be okay to discuss. Another rule for contact outside of the session was that we had to wait for a response. We weren't to send multiple texts or emails. We were to send what we needed once and to wait. This was actually extremely helpful when we were going through a lot of suicidal ideation, especially at night. We knew we could reach out if needed, and we knew we had to wait for a response. We knew that we would get one because she was always consistent with what she said she would do. Usually, by the time she would respond, we were already starting to feel better. And then we were able to talk about how I helped myself while I waited, which reinforced my belief in my ability to cope. This dynamic and these boundaries were able to keep our relationship within the appropriate therapeutic supports and out of the rescue and caretaker pitfalls.
I think it's important to remember that it's often in the time that we are waiting for a response from our support people that we are faced with what to do to be okay until then. This leads to the discovery of how we can help ourselves, which eventually leads to the ability to cope independently. Therapists need to remember that their client has survived in brilliant ways up until this point, and swooping into rescue isn't always helpful. Being able to judge when a client is in urgent need and also when to give them some time and space to work things out for a while on their own and then touch base is something to think about and varies with the situation and the client. I also agree that important discoveries and thoughts happen outside of the therapy office, and the ability to write them down in an email so they can be talked about during the next session helps make the time in office more productive. And like Garden System said, sometimes it's really scary to bring up some thoughts and feelings verbally. Sometimes writing them in an email instead of verbally talking about them first is easier and can make verbalizing about them later in session less scary.
Sometimes we as clients forget our own strengths and skills to cope on our own. I remember my therapist asking me, "What did you do before me?" She had a point, but we cheekily responded that there was no time before. It can feel really good to finally have support, understanding, and empathy, and then we forget to use our skills. That was another rule with the boundaries around contact outside of session. If we were in distress, we were expected to attempt to use coping skills on our own first, And she would ask what we had already done to try and help ourselves when we did reach out. Her reinforcing the use of skills on our own meant that we were helping ourselves and she wasn't rescuing us, but rather empowering us in our own strengths. Her responsiveness and consistency helped us to feel supported.
Yes, consistency is one of the most important things when forming a secure attachment. And we know that forming a secure, healthy attachment with a therapist leads to the ability to form secure attachments with others in daily life. I think there are a couple of other things that need to be brought up when talking about the therapeutic relationship and boundaries before we move on to talking about boundaries with other people in our lives, like friends and family members. The first is physical contact. For example, hugs. Some therapists refuse to hug clients, while others hug without consent. As a teacher, I ask if my students would like a hug and respect the child if the answer is no. Giving choice about our bodies and other people touching them is very important to model and respect because it should always be a choice. My body is mine and your body is yours, and no one should be touching my body without my consent, period. Children's bodies are often not respected, and children receive the message that what happens to their body is not their choice. For me, as a grown adult, I have problems with feeling safe when other people hug me or touch me. I've gotten many gift cards over the years from parents of my students to go get a massage, but I never use them. And it took me a long time to feel safe receiving a hug from my therapist that I have seen for years. I always wanted a hug, but wouldn't ask. My therapist started asking if I wanted a hug, and I started saying yes. And even though at first it felt uncomfortable, it was still me saying yes, I want this. And since I've developed a healthy attachment and trust with my therapist, over time, the hug started feeling good and comforting.
Touch, hugs, holding hands, shaking hands, those are certainly hot topics for the therapeutic relationship, especially when the client has sexual trauma. Some therapists draw a pretty tight line around this topic, and there are good reasons for doing so. Also, there are good reasons for using touch, and it's called therapeutic touch. I read a research article on therapeutic touch in graduate school, but it wasn't the first time I came across the term. I first heard it from a therapist on an inpatient unit. We were in distress, and Jenny was fronting and attempting to hide from the entire unit. And this therapist came, and she sat right down on the cold, hard floor in her fancy pantsuit right next to us and held out both her hands and asked if we wanted therapeutic touch. It was exactly what Jenny needed in that moment. Note that she asked consent and made herself available. She did not touch us first. She also used this term, therapeutic touch, instead of just asking to hold our hand. It made it clear what sort of touch was going to occur. Jenny took her hands very tentatively, but that connection sent instant relief throughout our whole body. It's also a lesson for us on just what is appropriate touch. Yet we have to realize why it is scary to use therapeutic touch. Very common misconduct between a therapist and their client is the formation of a sexual relationship. And I have heard of a client suing their therapist over a hug, and of course that therapist now refuses to even shake hands with anyone now. So it makes sense that the topic of using touch is a scary topic for both client and therapist. Yet, therapeutic touch can be extraordinarily healing. And now there's this whole therapeutic touch model, which is far more in depth than what we are talking about here today. And a hug can be just a hug and not necessarily therapeutic touch, and as is holding someone's hand. But that could be a whole episode by itself. The main point here really is to ask yourself how the hug or holding of hand is beneficial for the client. What does the touch mean? A hug is for the benefit of the client, and when your client is a multiple, that can get a bit complicated, especially with the littles of a system. Littles may want to be held and start viewing the therapist as their mom or their dad. They may try to elicit touch through hugs and such that other parts in the system are not okay with. A little might be out and want that hug, but then there is a switch and an adult part might be out and feel very confused about what is currently happening. So those are some things to think about and consider before engaging in any touch.
Yeah, I'm sitting over here kind of cringing. If a therapist came up to me in a moment of crisis and asked me if I wanted therapeutic touch, I'd be freaked out. I'm not saying that there would be no part of me that wouldn't maybe want to engage, but overall, that would send us into an internal panic. Touch is still very confusing for us as a system. So yes, asking for consent on the therapist part is super important. This might feel differently for me if we agreed that feeling okay and safe with touch was something we wanted to work on. But as a means of comfort in crisis, I have a much different reaction and response than Garden System. I think it's good to note that every client will be different and have different reactions.
Know yourself. Know your client. My therapist knows us well enough to know when it is okay and when it is not okay. We are much more comfortable with touch and closeness than others, and it can be a fine line with touch. We'll include an article we found written by a therapist on the subject in our show notes, and we encourage each of you to do your own research on the benefits and cautions with touch and therapy. Clear communication is really important. We made it abundantly clear how we felt about it, especially after being directed how to hug ourselves. Hugging ourselves, however, turned out to be kind of a trigger. In the beginning of my therapeutic journey, when we were still single, we remember our therapist teaching us the butterfly hug, and we remember just staring at her and thinking, WTF, we have to hug ourselves? Now that we've moved past that triggering memory that made us hate hugging ourselves, we actually do enjoy the butterfly hug and find it very calming and soothing. The butterfly hug is where you cross your arms in front of your chest and gently alternate patting each arm with your hands. We now use this butterfly hug as a way for our adult parts to soothe our little parts.
I model this butterfly hug for my students. It's adorable to look at these little people hugging themselves, usually with big, goofy grins on their faces. The topic of boundaries also comes up with friends and family members. Some of my friends and family members know about my DID, and some of them I have not personally told. We will get into more about disclosure later, but boundaries are important in any relationship. I have a couple of friends that I'm closer to, and we text once in a while and hang out, but I have to say I naturally keep my circle small. I hang out with my wifey and the kids most, and honestly, it just feels safer this way. I feel like I am more comfortable hanging out with other multiples because I can be authentically all of me's. Not to say that I don't have singleton friends that accept me, but it still feels a little strange being all of myself, and I end up masking a lot, which we will also talk about more in a bit. Boundaries for me means keeping my circle small and only spending extra time with those that respect me and my others. I've also learned to tell as much information about myself as I feel comfortable with, and that varies from friend to friend. I have learned that trust isn't a given. It is earned over time. And to protect myself, I need to make sure those that I share with are wanting what's in my best interest and support my dreams and goals, and believe me and my truth about my own life.
Boundaries are also about choosing who to include or not include in your life. We have a lot to say about choosing our community, but we want to address how difficult it can be to set boundaries with our family and friends, the very people that have been around us our whole life. Considering the sort of trauma those of us with DID have endured throughout our childhood, trying to set boundaries with family and longtime friends can be super challenging. Families sometimes can act like they don't have to respect any boundaries at all. It might sound like, I'm your mom and I have a right to blah, blah, blah. That's just not true. Or it might sound like, I'm just trying to help you. Why aren't you more grateful? For several years, my mom was coming over to my house to help with watching the kids and with cleaning, while I, as a single mom, tried to hold down a full-time job. I actually held down as many as 4 jobs at one time. I really did need the help. Except there were times she wasn't so helpful. She had a harder time dealing with all 4 of my kiddos than I did. She only had 2 kids herself, me and my brother, and we are 8 years apart. It was too much for her, and it was definitely becoming evident in how she would end up exploding with anger at my kids. I had to get her out of my house. It wasn't easy to do because it meant that I wouldn't have the extra help, but it was necessary because it actually wasn't helpful. There were a lot of discussions, arguments, raised voices, and the tough reality of being firm. It caused a lot of tears and heartache too. Sometimes setting boundaries hurts.
Setting boundaries is hard, but sometimes it is necessary in order to live a peaceful life. I tried for many years to set boundaries with my mom, but she did not respect my boundaries and told me how disappointed she was with me. My solution was to move over 2,000 miles away. It was one of the best decisions I ever made. I've created a peaceful, fulfilling life that I absolutely love. I am much happier, even though it took me many years to rid myself of the guilt I felt from leaving and living my own life. I no longer question if it was the right thing to do. I know it was, because she was no longer able to disrespect my boundaries. It's my opinion to do whatever it takes to get yourself in a situation where most everyone in your life is respectful of you and the boundaries you set. People, especially family members, tend to be good at laying on the guilt. But the truth of it all is, if they aren't supporting you in a healthy way and adding to your happiness, then why have them in your life?
So up and moving 2,000 miles away is no easy task. I know you were young and had very little cash, so how'd you do it?
You know, one of my biggest strengths is determination. I wanted to move. I wanted to get out of there. I just turned 27. I had a girlfriend for about a year. We looked up jobs and secured a rental house. We wouldn't know for sure about the jobs until we actually got to Florida, but we knew someone would hire us, and we already had phone interviews before we left. We made sure the trauma therapist we found that knew how to treat DID was within minutes of our rental, and we packed up a U-Haul and left. I didn't tell my family until we were hundreds of miles away. Best and scariest feeling ever. After a couple of days of driving, we arrived in Florida at our rental, and the universe came through with a pair of lesbian neighbors that often brought us dinner, cleaned and cleared out our entire backyard, and put lights up and lawn chairs. Amazing people that we are still friends with to this day. I got a teaching job right away. My girlfriend got a job too. We literally had a couple of $100s left after we moved, and it was super tight, but it was well worth the risk for freedom and happiness. So my advice to anyone who may be thinking they would want to move too, but don't know if it would all work out, well, just do it and make it work out. If there's a will, there's a way. And it probably also helped that we were young and what some would call stupid. I call it hopeful and very determined. And just done. So done.
Wow, what a story. Well, we are glad you made it to Florida. You sometimes just have to do things. I know a few people that even went through homelessness just to get away. There are a lot of tough choices that we have to make. None of them are easy. Many of them are traumatic even. There came a point where we recognized that we were surrounded by a lot of toxic people. We didn't have supportive friends, and we realized that we had to make some changes. We ended up deleting all of our social media accounts and just reevaluating what we needed in terms of friends, community, and support. When we finally decided to get back on social media, we did so cautiously. We became selective about who we would friend and allow into our circle. We still have a relatively low friend count, and we are slow to accept new friend requests. It felt incredibly lonely at first, but we place such a high value on strong and deep relationships, and we just didn't want to add superficial relationships onto our plate. It was really an empowering thing to do, as we were taking our lives into our own control. I could say no to people. I could decide who felt safe to talk to and who didn't. Of course, now that we have our podcast and we are growing our community, it is a little different now, and we've been a bit more open on social media, but it is still our choice. We find joy in connecting with other people that have DID and therapists that treat DID. One difference between then and now is how my new circle of friends responds to me compared to the old larger group of people I used to be connected with. For example, while in graduate school, I was having a tough time and I really needed encouragement to get through this assignment. I posted on my social media about the struggle and asked for some encouragement. On my old social media accounts, I would have been called attention-seeking and dramatic. With the new circle of friends I had, all I got was encouragement. They showed up and cheered me on, and my spirits were lifted, and I was able to power through and get those assignments done. I remember reflecting that night on what a difference it made in choosing who I allowed to be a part of my life.
Who you surround yourself with makes all the difference. It is nice having a choice and being able to say no now, even though sometimes it is hard because of thoughts about what other people might think. Well, people are going to think whatever they'll think, and that's something we can't control. But what is in our control is who we decide to have in our lives. We realize some people may feel stuck with having to be in to have some toxic people in their life. Sometimes in life, for a time period, you do have to deal with toxic people. I think one thing that helped me when I felt stuck during different periods of my life was reminding myself regularly that they were toxic. That way, when they said or did stuff, it wouldn't hurt as badly, and it helped me stop blaming myself. One of the things that helped me before I found or had the opportunity to have other multiples in my life was to find them in online communities. Unfortunately, a lot of the online communities that are out there aren't as monitored as I would have liked them to be, causing some of the forums to be a bit chaotic. And very few are specific to DID. That is why Garden System and I are in the process of creating a private online community using the Circle community platform so that others can connect with people like them, no matter where they find themselves in life and in their healing journey. We will be releasing more information about the community soon. We can't wait to be able to connect with many of our listeners. This community will not only be for people with lived experience, but also for therapists that treat dissociative disorders and for people that support loved ones with DID. We also want to promote the Healing Together conference for DID that is put on by an Infinite Mind. The conference is every year in February in Orlando, Florida. It is where Garden System and I have met many people that have become our chosen family. For more information, please visit aninfinitemind.org.
We are so very excited about the community we are building and can't wait to invite you all to be a part of it. Sign up for our mailing list at acoupleofmultiples.com to be in the know about all upcoming things like the community. We absolutely love the Healing Together conference as well. We've even spoken there the last 2 years. Finding your tribe is really important. It made a huge difference for us to be able to be just us. There are so many places in our lives where we can't just be us, and we're always having to mask ourselves and our parts. Masking is a term that is becoming more widely known. I see masking as the fake face you put on to try and fit in and appear normal to the rest of the world. And frankly, I'm so done pretending and faking. We are who we are, and we just want to be our authentic selves no matter what.
It would be really nice to be able to be our authentic selves no matter where we are at or what we are doing. It feels like most singletons have the freedom to be themselves when they wish to be. I know a person could choose to mask whether they are a singleton or a multiple at any point. It seems like a protective measure to try to prevent people from seeing who they really are or how they really are feeling. Multiples sometimes hide or mask for many understandable reasons. People can be judgmental and not take time to understand what is going on for someone and why. I especially think about the workplace here. It is a place I mask a lot, even though many of my coworkers and boss know about this podcast now and a bit about my trauma history. It simply isn't appropriate for me to have one of my littles or tweens or teens out while teaching. I must not allow for the natural flow of switching to occur while at work. So if we do switch, the part ends up masking to try to cover the switch. We try hard to ground. We try hard to get our teacher adult parts back, but sometimes that doesn't happen, so we do our best to make sure no one notices. There are lots of times out in public and around friends that I mask because it seems easier to try to fit in than to explain what is going on if and when I switch. The only time it seems easy to be ourselves, whoever is out, is among other multiples, or my wife here, Garden System, and our kids, or teenagers, I should say. Recently, though, especially after coming out publicly with this podcast, I have felt less concerned about masking. And I must say, I didn't realize how much I masked until I was less concerned about doing it, about hiding. If many people are aware now that I have DID, then I don't have to try to purposely hide it as much. It's not like I let everyone inside loose and don't think about how switching in certain situations will affect things. But with the podcast, also came a decision on my part that anyone technically could hear and know about me having DID. After years of masking in most places, I do wish to live more authentically. I wish that everyone everywhere could be treated and given the same opportunities. I hope that my decision to be out publicly about my DID helps clear up some of the myths and misconceptions that are out there about DID. We are educated, productive members of society, and we want the world to see that. Unmasking and being authentic in more places helps the world see who we are.
Determining safety is also important when we make decisions to unmask. Work typically requires certain parts that know how to do the job to be present, while the others have to sort of sit back and stay out of the way. One of the unique things we did while in graduate school was bring everyone along for class. So, technically, every single part of us has the therapeutic skills that we learned in school during our practicum and internship. Yet, we still have just one part that fronts for others to see while we are on the job, and that is Sadie. When we were working as a financial advisor, that was Leanna's job, and really only Leanna knew how to do that job. And that made the job extremely difficult to do on a daily basis because we switch often. Once, Victoria fronted, took one look around the office, and then immediately reached out to our therapist in a panic. We've had Daisy and Blossom front at the financial advisor office, and then they are stuck trying to pretend to be Leanna. Blossom did it on purpose once because she decided she wanted to use our business account funds to buy markers to keep in our desk at work. Oy! Luckily, we did not let that happen. But when we're not at work and just browsing around the store or going to the beach or hanging out at the swimming pool, it would be nice to just let everyone be instead of worrying about what everyone around us will think, especially with social media and viral video posts. It's a terrifying thought that some stranger might catch Daisy doing who knows what on a video and then post that video to the internet. It's hard for the general public that doesn't know about DID to comprehend actions that appear rather immature in comparison to the adult body that their eyes can see. And this goes back to choosing your community, your friends, and who you surround yourself with so that you can feel comfortable just being yourself whenever you can. If you've only ever masked, even in front of close friends and family, it can feel scary to allow the others to show themselves. With Drew here, it always just came naturally to just be us, but with others, when we catch ourselves switching, there can be this freeze that happens because we know we've switched, but the other person doesn't know it yet, but they will if we open our mouths and someone else is talking. See, several of our parts have very different voices. There's always this fear with someone seeing a different part of you for the first time. Can they handle it? Will they be afraid? Will they start ignoring us? It can be really hard to go through rejection and being ghosted by people you thought were friends.
Yes, this unmasking does give one the opportunity to share and provide education for others and hope that it is well received. Just like Garden System said, when we are not at work, we try to just go with the natural flow of who is out. It is extremely hard to have to stop or prevent the natural flow for so many consecutive hours at work every day. So when we get the chance to just let go, it is such a relief. And as Garden System was saying, it really does matter who you spend your time with. It's helpful to surround yourself with people that know about your situation and are accepting and loving of all of yous. Takes the pressure off of constantly having to mask and hide. That is one huge benefit of having chosen to marry garden system. We don't hide from each other. There have been relationships I have been in the past where I didn't feel free to be all of me's, and that was very difficult and ultimately contributed to why those relationships didn't work long term. Also, I think it is important for us to talk about how one goes about disclosing to people when one decides they want to disclose to someone. Disclosure is a personal decision. There's no right or wrong when it comes to who you decide to disclose to and who you don't. For instance, just because someone is your family member doesn't mean they need to know. I have personally not told my family, mostly because some of them were involved in my abuse and or haven't respected my boundaries. However, there are benefits to deciding to tell certain people you have DID so that you are more free to unmask, and behavior might make more sense to someone with an explanation. Garden System, would you be willing to talk about how disclosure came about with your kids? How did you decide when to tell them? What was their reaction?
Disclosure is complicated. You have to figure out exactly what you want to disclose, to whom you want to disclose, the reasons for the disclosure, and how to keep all of yourselves safe through disclosure. It's a tangled web of thoughts, emotions, and actions. You have your boss or your coworkers, your family, your friends, your doctors and dentists, your neighbors, maybe teachers or professors, and your spouse and kids. With kids, it can be tricky to figure out what to say or how to say it because you have to take into consideration their developmental stage and their ability to comprehend what you are telling them. For my kids, my oldest figured it out on her own with just a small little prompt from me. I was homeschooling my children at the time, and my oldest was around middle school age, and I assigned her the book Soldier's Heart by Gary Paulson to read. Then she was to do a research paper on PTSD. That was really all I told her. I didn't explain what PTSD was or give her any more direction than that. She learned about DID through her research for the paper, and she came to me one evening and just said, "Mom, you have DID, don't you?" She's a pretty smart cookie. I told her yes, and we talked a little bit about it, and she seemed pretty relieved afterwards and said, "Now I know what to call it." That's when she started telling me all about how she and her siblings knew how to get the littles out to play with them. I don't really remember having specific conversations with the other kids. It was just sort of a thing everyone knew after that.
It just also popped into my head that there is a great example of disclosure to a significant other portrayed in the short film, Petals of a Rose. We interviewed Dylan Crumpler, who created the film, and his mom Holly in episode 8 of this first season. There is a link in our show notes to watch the film if you're interested. The film is 15 minutes long, and it is a great way to introduce DID to a friend or family member.
When deciding to disclose, there is no right or wrong answer or way to do it. Disclosure looks different for each and every one of us. It's good to weigh the benefits and possible consequences of disclosure for each person that you want to disclose to. Those consequences may be negative or positive. You'll also want to weigh the consequences of not disclosing as well. This is something you can always discuss with your therapist to help sort out what will be the right choice for all of you.
When I have to make difficult decisions and I'm having a hard time figuring out what I should do, I make pros and cons lists. You can do this type of list when deciding whether to disclose to someone or not. You can put your reasons or benefits for disclosing on the pros side and the reasons or drawbacks for disclosing on the cons side. You can do the same type of list for choosing not to disclose. You can put your reasons or benefits from not disclosing on one side and your reasons or drawbacks from not disclosing on the other. Then compare lists. Maybe even assign a number to each item or reason. 1 being not really important to 10 being a very important reason. Then add them up. List making helps organize the chaos in my head and helps me visually see my thoughts.
Also, consult all of your parts. Disclosure should really be a team decision. Find out what all of you think about the disclosure. Is everyone on board? Are parts hesitant? If so, that would be something to explore as well. If parts have reservations about the disclosure, they may have good reasons.
It's crazy to think we are wrapping up our first season of A Couple of Multiples. In this episode, our season finale, we talked about boundaries in the therapeutic relationship and also boundaries with friends and family members. We talked about choosing your community and creating your chosen family. We also discussed living authentically and how and when to choose to unmask and disclose as a person with DID.
It's been a wild 2 months producing 12 episodes. Thank you so much for listening and joining us on this incredible journey. We will be taking a short break, and then we will kick off season 2 on June 11th. We will do another weekly series totaling 12 episodes, and we are very excited for the interviews we have lined up and the topics that we are planning to cover. We will spend season 2 focusing on all things discovering your system, getting to know all of yous, internal communication, internal cooperation, and living with functional multiplicity. If you haven't, please visit our website at acoupleofmultiples.com and sign up for our mailing list so you can stay up to date with all the amazing things we have planned for you.
Thank you for hanging out with A Couple of Multiples today. From your hosts, Drew
and Garden System, thank you for listening to A Couple of Multiples, the reality of dissociative identity disorder.
This podcast is intended for educational purposes and is not a replacement for therapy.
Listening to this podcast does not constitute a therapeutic relationship with the hosts or any potential guest speakers.
If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review. We would love to hear what you enjoyed the most.
You can visit our website at acoupleofmultiples.com for additional information and resources, and to also subscribe to our mailing list to receive future updates.
Remember, you matter and are loved for being all of yous.